The Roman Empire at the time of Tiberius's rise was a formidable force that had undergone a transformation under the rule of Augustus. The Republic had collapsed under the weight of civil wars, and Augustus had carefully constructed a system that preserved the illusion of republican governance while consolidating absolute power in his hands. He established the Principate, a form of monarchy in all but name, which allowed him to wield authority without appearing to be a tyrant. By the time Augustus died in 14 CE, Rome had experienced relative peace, economic prosperity and territorial expansion, all of which had solidified his reputation as the founder of the empire. However, the question of succession remained precarious. Unlike monarchies with a clear hereditary system, the Principate relied on adoption, political maneuvering and Senate approval to pass power. The transition from Augustus to Tiberius was, therefore, not just a change in leadership but a crucial test for the new imperial system. Tiberius, the second emperor of Rome, is often remembered in a much darker light than his predecessor. While Augustus was celebrated as a visionary leader who restored order, Tiberius has been portrayed as a reluctant ruler, a paranoid autocrat and a deeply enigmatic figure. His reign lasted for nearly 23 years, yet it remains one of the most debated periods of Roman history. Unlike Augustus, who carefully curated his public image and maintained strong ties with the Senate and the Roman people, Tiberius was aloof, distrustful and secretive. His relationship with the Senate was strained, and he increasingly withdrew from Rome, governing from a distance while his ministers, particularly the Praetorian prefect Sejanus, exercised immense influence over state affairs. His later years were marked by political purges, treason trials, and a reclusive existence on the island of Capri, leading to an enduring image of a ruler consumed by suspicion and cruelty. The significance of Tiberius as the second emperor of Rome lies in the fact that his rule established a precedent for future emperors. Augustus had been able to consolidate power through his immense personal prestige, but Tiberius had to navigate a system that was still in its infancy. His reign demonstrated both the strengths and weaknesses of the Principate, particularly in terms of succession, governance, and the role of the Senate. While he was a competent administrator and a brilliant military strategist, his leadership style lacked the charisma and diplomatic finesse of Augustus. This contrast between the two rulers became a defining element of early imperial history, influencing the way later emperors would be judged. Tiberius's legacy is complex and often overshadowed by the negative portrayals in ancient sources. The primary accounts of his reign come from historians such as Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio, all of whom paint him in an unflattering light. Tacitus, writing with a deep-seated disdain for tyranny, depicts Tiberius as a ruler who gradually descended into despotism, relying on a network of informers and executing perceived enemies through a series of treason trials. Suetonius, whose biography of Tiberius is filled with sensational anecdotes, emphasizes the emperor's alleged depravity and indulgences on Capri, contributing to the image of a ruler who had lost all moral restraint. Cassius Dio presents a more balanced view but still portrays Tiberius as a deeply flawed figure, whose early promise was ultimately undone by his own mistrust and isolation. However, modern historians have re-examined Tiberius's reign with a more nuanced perspective. Some argue that he was an effective ruler who maintained the stability of the empire, strengthened its financial position, and avoided unnecessary military conflicts. His administrative policies were pragmatic, and he left the empire in a strong economic state. His withdrawal from public life, while often seen as a sign of disengagement, can also be interpreted as an attempt to reduce the burden of autocracy and encourage senatorial governance. The problem, however, was that the Senate was ill-equipped to handle the responsibility, and figures like Sejanus exploited the vacuum of power, leading to an era of political intrigue and repression. One of the key aspects of Tiberius's rule that requires deeper examination is his approach to governance. Unlike Augustus, who actively engaged with the Senate and the Roman people, Tiberius was known for his reluctance to participate in public ceremonies and his preference for written communication over direct addresses. This created an atmosphere of uncertainty and detachment, making it difficult for the ruling elite to gauge his intentions. His interactions with the Senate were marked by a complex dynamic of deference and dominance. He maintained the outward forms of senatorial authority while simultaneously undermining their actual power. This led to a situation where the Senate, rather than acting as a check on imperial authority, became increasingly servile and dependent on the whims of the emperor. Another critical issue to explore is the role of Sejanus, the Praetorian prefect who rose to immense power under Tiberius. Sejanus was initially a trusted advisor, but over time he consolidated power to the point where he was effectively ruling in Tiberius's name. His manipulation of the political landscape led to the elimination of potential rivals, including members of the imperial family. The downfall of Sejanus in 31 CE marked a turning point in Tiberius's reign, leading to an even greater sense of paranoia and a crackdown on perceived enemies. The aftermath of Sejanus's execution saw an increase in treason trials, purges, and a culture of fear that permeated the Roman elite. This period is often cited as evidence of Tiberius's descent into tyranny, but it also raises questions about the nature of power in an autocratic system where loyalty was constantly in question. The documentary will also explore the question of why Tiberius withdrew to the island of Capri in his later years. Was this an act of escape, an attempt to govern from afar, or a calculated move to distance himself from the political intrigues of Rome? His retreat has often been interpreted as a sign of disengagement, but it could also be seen as a strategic decision to avoid direct involvement in the brutal power struggles that were unfolding. The image of Tiberius as a reclusive emperor, indulging in excesses while Rome suffered under oppression, is largely based on Suetonius's accounts, which may have been exaggerated for dramatic effect. The reality may have been more complex, with Tiberius still actively involved in decision-making through correspondence and trusted intermediaries. His death in 37 CE remains a subject of intrigue. Some accounts suggest that he was smothered on the orders of Caligula and Macro, the new Praetorian prefect, while others claim that he died of natural causes. Regardless of the exact circumstances, his passing marked the end of an era and the beginning of a much more chaotic phase in Roman history under Caligula. The transition of power after Tiberius's death further underscores the fragile nature of imperial succession, a problem that would plague the empire for centuries. Ultimately, Tiberius's reign is a study in contrasts. He was a brilliant military leader but a hesitant ruler. He maintained stability but created an atmosphere of fear. He sought to uphold the Augustan system but struggled with its inherent contradictions. His story is one of power, paranoia, and the challenges of governing an empire that had not yet fully defined its imperial identity. By examining his life and rule, we gain insight into the complexities of leadership in an autocratic system and the delicate balance between authority and insecurity. The documentary will seek to move beyond the sensationalized accounts of his character and explore the deeper political, social, and psychological dimensions of his reign, offering a more comprehensive understanding of the man who shaped the early years of the Roman Empire. Tiberius was born on November 16, 42 BCE, into one of Rome's most distinguished patrician families, the Claudii. His full name at birth was Tiberius Claudius Nero, a name that reflected the aristocratic lineage of the Claudian family, which had been prominent in Roman politics for centuries. The Claudii were known for their pride, conservatism, and strong sense of tradition, qualities that would later be reflected in Tiberius's character and approach to governance. His father, also named Tiberius Claudius Nero, was a supporter of Julius Caesar's assassins and later aligned himself with Mark Antony in the power struggles that followed Caesar's death. However, as the tides of Roman politics shifted, his father found himself on the losing side of history, and his mother, Livia Drusilla, made a fateful decision that would alter Tiberius's future. Livia Drusilla was one of the most politically astute and influential women of her time. In 39 BCE, she divorced Tiberius's father and married Octavian, the future Augustus, who was then consolidating his power in the aftermath of the civil wars. This marriage linked young Tiberius to the rising star of Roman politics, placing him in proximity to the man who would become Rome's first emperor. Although Augustus had no biological sons, his efforts to build a stable dynastic succession would deeply impact Tiberius's life and career. From an early age, Tiberius was aware that he was being positioned for a significant role in the empire, though at the time, he was not the preferred heir. As a child, Tiberius received a rigorous education befitting a member of the Roman elite. He studied rhetoric, philosophy, history, and military strategy, disciplines that were essential for a future statesman and general. His tutors emphasized discipline and self-restraint, values that he would carry throughout his life. Unlike Augustus, who was known for his charm and ability to win over the public, Tiberius was more reserved and introverted. He was not naturally inclined toward public displays of affability, which would later contribute to his reputation as a cold and distant ruler. However, he excelled in his studies and developed a deep appreciation for literature and Greek philosophy, particularly Stoicism, which influenced his austere and pragmatic approach to life. By the time Tiberius reached adulthood, Augustus had solidified his power and was carefully managing the transition from republic to empire. One of Augustus's key strategies for securing his rule was to create a dynasty, ensuring that his chosen successors would maintain stability after his death. Tiberius, as the stepson of Augustus, was drawn into this political landscape. Although Augustus initially favored his own blood relatives, such as his nephews and grandsons, Tiberius was increasingly entrusted with military and political responsibilities, proving his capabilities on the battlefield. Tiberius's military career began in earnest in his early 20s when he was assigned command in the eastern provinces. His first major campaign was in Parthia, where he successfully negotiated the return of the lost standards of Crassus, a symbolic victory that enhanced his reputation. This diplomatic and military success demonstrated his strategic intelligence and ability to handle delicate political situations. Augustus recognized his competence and soon entrusted him with greater military commands. One of the defining aspects of Tiberius's early career was his service in the northern frontiers of the empire. Between 15 and 7 BCE, he led several successful campaigns in Germania, Pannonia, and the Alpine regions, securing Roman control over these volatile territories. His military leadership was characterized by careful planning, discipline, and an emphasis on maintaining order. Unlike some generals who sought glory through reckless conquests, Tiberius was methodical and cautious, ensuring that his campaigns were sustainable in the long term. His troops respected him for his discipline and fairness, though he was not known for personal warmth. His success on the battlefield made him one of the most capable generals of his time, but it also solidified his reputation as a man who preferred military life over the political intrigues of Rome. While Tiberius's military career was flourishing, his personal life was shaped by political considerations. In 20 BCE he married Vipsania Agrippina, the daughter of Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa, Augustus's closest friend and most trusted general. This marriage was a strategic alliance, strengthening Tiberius's ties to Augustus's inner circle. By all accounts, Tiberius and Vipsania had a genuine affection for each other, and their marriage produced a son, Drusus Julius Caesar. However, their happiness was short-lived. In 12 BCE, following the death of Agrippa, Augustus forced Tiberius to divorce Vipsania and marry Julia the Elder, Augustus's only biological daughter. This marriage was meant to further integrate Tiberius into the imperial family, but it proved disastrous. Julia was known for her extravagant lifestyle and alleged affairs, and she and Tiberius were fundamentally incompatible. Tiberius, who valued discipline and restraint, found Julia's behavior offensive, while Julia resented being married to a man who showed her little affection. The marriage quickly deteriorated, and Tiberius, humiliated and unhappy, withdrew from public life. In 6 BCE, he made the extraordinary decision to go into self-imposed exile on the island of Rhodes. This move shocked Rome, as it was highly unusual for a man of his status to voluntarily step away from power. Historians have debated his reasons for this decision, with some suggesting that he was frustrated by Augustus's favoritism toward his younger heirs, while others believe he was simply seeking a respite from political pressures. Tiberius remained in Rhodes for nearly a decade, living in relative obscurity while Augustus continued to groom other successors. However, fate had different plans. Augustus's chosen heirs, his grandsons Gaius and Lucius Caesar, both died unexpectedly, leaving the emperor with no viable successors other than Tiberius. In 2 CE, Augustus recalled him to Rome and officially adopted him as his heir, forcing him back into the political arena. Although Tiberius accepted the role, he did so reluctantly. Unlike Augustus, who had actively pursued power, Tiberius seemed burdened by it, a theme that would continue throughout his reign. As the designated successor, Tiberius was given greater responsibilities in the administration of the empire. He resumed his military career, leading successful campaigns in Germania once again, and was gradually integrated into the mechanisms of governance. Augustus ensured that Tiberius was well prepared for the transition, making him co-ruler in the years leading up to his death. However, their relationship was complex. While Augustus recognized Tiberius's capabilities, he never fully trusted him in the same way he had trusted Agrippa or his deceased grandsons. Tiberius, for his part, resented the way Augustus had manipulated his personal life for political gain, particularly the forced marriage to Julia and the years spent in exile. One of the most influential figures in Tiberius's life was his mother, Livia Drusilla. Livia was a formidable political player who wielded significant influence behind the scenes. She was deeply invested in securing Tiberius's position as Augustus's successor and worked tirelessly to ensure his rise to power. Some ancient sources suggest that she may have even played a role in eliminating potential rivals, though this remains speculative. What is certain is that her presence loomed large in Tiberius's life, both as a source of support and as a figure whose ambitions often intersected with his own. Their relationship was complicated. Tiberius respected his mother's intelligence but reportedly resented her interference in his decisions once he became emperor. By the time Augustus died in 14 CE, Tiberius was in his mid-50s, an experienced military leader and administrator but also a man deeply shaped by personal losses and political betrayals. His early life had been one of duty, sacrifice and preparation, but he had never sought power for its own sake. As he took the throne, he inherited an empire that was stable yet politically fragile, with an elite class that was unsure of how he would rule. His early experiences, his military successes, his forced marriage, his exile in Rhodes, and his relationship with Augustus and Livia, had all contributed to his reserved and cautious nature. Unlike Augustus, who had ruled with a combination of charm and calculated authority, Tiberius would approach governance with a more distant and pragmatic style, setting the stage for one of the most enigmatic reigns in Roman history. From the moment Augustus established his rule over Rome, the question of succession loomed over his reign. As the first emperor of Rome, he had effectively dismantled the old republican system while maintaining the illusion that it still functioned. His power rested on military support, political maneuvering and public approval, but it was also deeply personal. There was no official framework for transferring authority after his death. Thus, he sought to create a dynasty, ensuring that his chosen successor would continue his policies and maintain stability. However, the road to succession was anything but straightforward, as Augustus's early heirs met untimely deaths, forcing him to reconsider his options multiple times. Tiberius, though a capable leader, was never Augustus's first choice. He was a reluctant successor, brought into the fold only after the emperor's preferred heirs were lost, and his rise to power was marked by exile, disappointment and political necessity rather than ambition. In the early years of Augustus's reign, it was widely assumed that his nephew and son-in-law, Marcus Claudius Marcellus, would be his heir. Marcellus was young, charismatic, and closely tied to Augustus's family through marriage to his daughter Julia. He was given important responsibilities, despite his inexperience, and was positioned as the future leader of Rome. However, his sudden death in 23 BCE at the age of 19 disrupted Augustus's plans and forced him to reconsider his succession strategy. Rather than choosing Tiberius, who was already proving himself as a competent military commander, Augustus turned to Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa, his most trusted general and political ally. Agrippa was much older than Marcellus, but he was indispensable to Augustus. He had played a key role in securing Augustus's power, commanding military victories that solidified Rome's dominance. Recognizing Agrippa's importance, Augustus arranged for him to marry Julia, integrating him more closely into the imperial family. This marriage produced several children, two of whom, Gaius and Lucius Caesar, became the new focal points of Augustus's dynastic ambitions. From birth, Gaius and Lucius were groomed to inherit the empire, receiving prestigious titles and responsibilities at a young age. They were granted political offices and honored with public ceremonies, signaling to the Roman elite that they were the future rulers. Augustus's intent was clear. Power would pass from him to his grandsons, ensuring that his bloodline would continue to dominate Rome. Tiberius, despite his military accomplishments, was increasingly sidelined during this period. He continued to serve the empire loyally, leading successful campaigns in the provinces, but he was never given the same public recognition as Augustus's grandsons. He must have recognized that as long as Gaius and Lucius lived, he would remain in the background, performing his duties without the prospect of ultimate power. This dynamic became even more frustrating when Augustus forced him to divorce his beloved wife, Vipsania, and marry Julia, who was notorious for her extravagant lifestyle and rumored affairs. The marriage was a political necessity, meant to further tie Tiberius to the imperial family, but it was a deeply unhappy union. Julia and Tiberius had no personal affection for each other, and the marriage only deepened his dissatisfaction with his role in Augustus's plans. Frustrated by his situation, Tiberius made a shocking decision in 6 BCE. He went into voluntary exile on the island of Rhodes. His departure from Rome was unprecedented. He was a respected general and a member of the imperial family, yet he chose to remove himself from political life, effectively renouncing any claim to power. Historians have debated his motivations, but several factors likely contributed to his decision. He may have felt humiliated by his forced marriage to Julia and the clear preference Augustus showed for his grandsons. He may have wished to avoid the cutthroat politics of the imperial court, where loyalty meant little in the face of ambition. Some sources even suggest that he hoped to avoid being used as a mere placeholder, forced to wait in the wings while Augustus's chosen heirs came of age. Whatever his reasons, Tiberius's exile lasted nearly a decade. He lived quietly in Rhodes, studying philosophy and keeping a low profile. He avoided the political intrigue of Rome and did not involve himself in military or administrative affairs. While he was content with this withdrawal from power, the situation in Rome was changing in ways that would ultimately bring him back into the imperial fold. The succession plan Augustus had so carefully crafted was beginning to unravel. In 2 BCE, Julia was caught in a scandal that shocked Rome. She was accused of engaging in multiple affairs and participating in debauched gatherings, a direct violation of Augustus's moral reforms. Augustus, who had promoted strict family values and laws against adultery, was furious. He exiled Julia, publicly disowning her and stripping her of her privileges. This scandal had far-reaching consequences, not just for Julia but for the broader succession plan. Her disgrace weakened the legitimacy of Augustus's dynastic ambitions, casting a shadow over the family he had worked so hard to elevate. More devastating, however, were the deaths of his beloved grandsons, Gaius and Lucius Caesar. Lucius died suddenly in 2 CE while traveling to Spain, and Gaius was mortally wounded in Armenia in 4 CE. Their deaths were a catastrophe for Augustus, who had spent years grooming them for power. With both of his preferred heirs gone, he was left with few options. He had no biological sons, and his carefully constructed dynastic vision was collapsing. He was now faced with the difficult task of finding a new successor, one who was experienced, competent, and politically viable. It was at this moment that Tiberius re-entered the picture. With no other strong candidates left, Augustus had little choice but to recall his stepson from exile. In 2 CE, Tiberius was summoned back to Rome and formally reinstated into the imperial family. However, his return was not entirely triumphant. He had spent years in Rhodes, away from the political center of the empire, and many in Rome viewed him with suspicion. He was not the charismatic, youthful figure that Augustus's grandsons had been. He was older, more reserved, and lacked the enthusiastic public support that Gaius and Lucius had enjoyed. Nevertheless, Augustus needed a capable successor, and Tiberius, despite his reluctance, was the best option available. In 4 CE, Augustus officially adopted Tiberius as his son, a symbolic act that solidified his place as the heir to the empire. At the same time, Augustus forced him to adopt his own nephew, Germanicus, to ensure a smoother transition of power in the future. This arrangement was another example of Augustus's careful planning. While he accepted Tiberius as his successor, he still sought to keep his own bloodline relevant by promoting Germanicus as the next generation of leadership. Tiberius, who had already endured a forced marriage and years of exile, had no choice but to comply. With his adoption, Tiberius was thrust back into the highest levels of Roman politics. He resumed his military career, leading new campaigns to secure the empire's borders. He proved once again that he was a competent and effective leader, earning victories in Germania and reaffirming Rome's dominance in the region. Augustus, despite his initial reluctance to embrace Tiberius as his heir, began granting him more authority, allowing him to share in the responsibilities of governance. By the time Augustus died in 14 CE, Tiberius was the undisputed successor, though his path to power had been far from straightforward. Unlike Augustus's previous heirs, who had been carefully cultivated and celebrated, Tiberius came to power under different circumstances. He was not a beloved prince, groomed for rule from childhood, but a seasoned general and politician who had spent much of his life on the periphery of Augustus's ambitions. His rise was not the result of a grand vision but of necessity, shaped by the deaths of others and the shifting realities of Roman politics. He had not sought power in the way Augustus had, nor had he been embraced by the Roman people in the same way that Gaius and Lucius had been. His journey to the throne was one of endurance rather than ambition, and his reluctance to rule would define much of his reign. When he finally assumed the role of emperor, he did so with a sense of duty rather than personal desire. The years of exile, disappointment, and political manipulation had hardened him, making him wary of the Senate, the aristocracy, and the shifting loyalties of the Roman elite. He had witnessed firsthand how easily favor could be lost, how ambition could destroy even the most carefully laid plans. These experiences shaped the kind of ruler he would become, one who was pragmatic, cautious, and often distant. While Augustus had ruled with a combination of political charm and ruthless efficiency, Tiberius would govern with restraint and suspicion, setting the stage for a very different chapter in Roman history. As Tiberius returned from exile and re-entered the political and military spheres of Rome, he found himself gradually drawn into the inner workings of Augustus's administration. While he had spent years in relative isolation on Rhodes, the deaths of Augustus's favored heirs forced a reconsideration of his role. Augustus, despite his previous reluctance, began to recognize Tiberius's experience and capability. However, the transition from exile to co-ruler was not immediate. It was a carefully orchestrated process, shaped by Augustus's political maneuvering and Tiberius's own cautious approach to power. Augustus had spent decades constructing an image of stability and continuity for Rome. His rule had been defined by the careful balancing of autocratic power with republican traditions, ensuring that his authority was accepted rather than challenged. With no official imperial system in place, succession was not guaranteed. To avoid the chaos that had followed the assassination of Julius Caesar, Augustus needed to ensure a smooth transfer of power, and Tiberius was the only viable candidate left. However, Tiberius's previous withdrawal from political life posed a challenge. He was not a beloved figure, nor had he been groomed for succession in the way Augustus's grandsons had been. His return to prominence required a period of rehabilitation, during which Augustus sought to reintroduce him as a central figure in Roman governance. One of the first steps in this process was granting Tiberius increasing political responsibilities. In 4 CE, alongside his formal adoption as Augustus's son, he was granted tribunician power, which allowed him to propose and veto legislation, giving him legal authority equal to that of Augustus himself. This was a significant moment as it placed him on a level above other senators and officials, marking him as the clear successor. To reinforce this position, Augustus also arranged for him to undertake major military campaigns, ensuring that he demonstrated his leadership on the battlefield before assuming full control of the empire. Tiberius had already proven his military capabilities in earlier campaigns, but now he was entrusted with greater responsibilities. His focus shifted to the frontiers of the empire, particularly in Germany and Pannonia. The Germanic tribes, after suffering defeats in previous encounters with Rome, continued to pose a threat to imperial stability. Augustus had long sought to expand Rome's influence in the region, but it remained a volatile and dangerous frontier. Tiberius was tasked with leading military efforts to secure these territories, and his campaigns were largely successful. He employed strategic warfare, avoiding reckless engagements and instead focusing on consolidating Rome's control through calculated offensives. His leadership in these campaigns reinforced his reputation as a skilled general, an image Augustus sought to promote as part of his succession strategy. At the same time, unrest in the provinces required Tiberius's attention. In Pannonia, a significant rebellion erupted in 6 CE, threatening Roman control in the region. The uprising, led by local tribal leaders, was one of the most serious challenges to Roman authority in years. Tiberius, alongside other experienced commanders, led a prolonged military campaign to suppress the rebellion. The war was brutal and took several years to fully quell, but by 9 CE the region was pacified. This victory further solidified Tiberius's standing as a capable leader, proving that he could handle the complex realities of governing an empire. Despite these successes, Tiberius's path to power was not without obstacles. His relationship with Augustus remained complicated, shaped by years of mistrust and political maneuvering. Augustus had never fully warmed to the idea of Tiberius as his heir, and even as he granted him authority, he continued to hold some reservations. This tension was reflected in Augustus's decision to promote Germanicus, the young and charismatic general who was married to his granddaughter. Germanicus was widely popular, and many believed that Augustus intended for him to ultimately take precedence over Tiberius. As part of his adoption agreement, Tiberius had been forced to adopt Germanicus as his own son, ensuring that he would have a direct successor in place. This arrangement reinforced the idea that Tiberius's rule, if it came, would be temporary. He was seen as a stopgap measure until Germanicus was ready to take over. Throughout this period, Augustus maintained tight control over the empire, ensuring that Tiberius never held unchecked power. Although he was granted significant responsibilities, he remained subordinate to Augustus, acting more as a deputy than an equal. This dynamic frustrated Tiberius, who had already endured years of political maneuvering and personal sacrifices. He had proven his abilities in military and administrative matters, yet he was still treated as a secondary figure. His growing resentment was evident in his demeanor. He became increasingly withdrawn, wary of the court's shifting allegiances and the political games that defined Roman leadership. As Augustus aged, the question of succession became more urgent. By the early 10 CE, his health was declining, and Rome prepared for the inevitable transition. Augustus had spent decades crafting a legacy that would endure beyond his lifetime, but he knew that the transition of power would be a delicate moment. He sought to ensure that when the time came, Tiberius would be accepted by the Senate, the military, and the people of Rome. To facilitate this, he gradually withdrew from active governance, allowing Tiberius to take on more responsibilities. By the final years of Augustus's reign, Tiberius was effectively running the empire, though always under the shadow of his adoptive father. The death of Augustus in 14 CE marked a turning point in Roman history. His passing was shrouded in mystery, with some sources suggesting that his wife, Livia Drusilla, Tiberius's mother, may have played a role in hastening his death to secure her son's position. Regardless of the truth, his death was immediately followed by a tense political transition. While Tiberius was the clear heir, the succession was not without controversy. Unlike Augustus, who had consolidated power gradually and carefully, Tiberius inherited authority in a single moment, and his legitimacy was not yet fully accepted. Tiberius's response to Augustus's death was characteristically cautious. He did not immediately assert himself as emperor, instead adopting a reserved approach that left many senators uncertain about his intentions. He allowed the Senate to debate his role, feigning reluctance to accept supreme authority. This was a political maneuver designed to avoid appearing overly ambitious, but it also reflected his own hesitations. He had never desired absolute power in the way Augustus had, and he understood the dangers that came with it. By hesitating, he forced the Senate to formally recognize him as Augustus's successor, ensuring that his authority was granted rather than seized. The transition was not entirely smooth. The military, which had been loyal to Augustus, was not immediately convinced of Tiberius's rule. In the provinces, legions stationed in the Rhine and Pannonia mutinied, demanding better pay and conditions. These revolts posed a direct challenge to Tiberius's authority, and their timing, so soon after Augustus's death, threatened to destabilize the empire. Tiberius, unwilling to personally confront the mutineers, sent Germanicus to restore order. Germanicus's success in quelling the uprisings only furthered his popularity, reinforcing the perception that he was the true future of Rome, rather than Tiberius. The political climate in Rome was also uneasy. The Senate, while formally acknowledging Tiberius's rule, remained uncertain about how he would govern. Unlike Augustus, who had carefully balanced authoritarian control with senatorial cooperation, Tiberius was more aloof and less inclined to engage in the political performances that had defined Augustus's reign. His reserved nature was often interpreted as arrogance or indifference, and he struggled to win the same level of public support that Augustus had enjoyed. His relationship with the Senate was tense from the beginning, marked by mutual suspicion and a lack of trust. Despite these challenges, Tiberius consolidated power over the following years, navigating the complexities of Rome's political landscape. His careful approach, while frustrating to some, ultimately ensured a stable transition. The foundations laid by Augustus allowed him to assume control without major upheaval, and his military experience provided him with the authority needed to maintain order. However, the circumstances of his rise to power shaped the way he ruled. His reluctance, his wariness of the Senate, and his lack of personal ambition all influenced the trajectory of his reign. The death of Augustus marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. Rome had known no other ruler for decades, and the empire now faced an uncertain future under Tiberius. While he had proven himself capable, he lacked the charisma and political mastery of his predecessor. His reign would be defined by a different style of leadership, one that emphasized caution over grand ambition. The uneasy transition of power foreshadowed the challenges to come, as Tiberius struggled to maintain control in a system that had been built around Augustus's singular rule. The foundation of the empire was strong, but the question remained, could Tiberius truly uphold the legacy of Augustus, or would his reign mark the beginning of a new, more troubled chapter in Roman history? Tiberius's early reign began under the immense shadow of Augustus, whose decades-long rule had transformed Rome from a fragile republic into a stable empire. Augustus had carefully crafted his image as both a protector of traditional Roman values and a pragmatic ruler who brought prosperity and order. His death in 14 CE left a vacuum that Tiberius had to fill, but the transition was anything but smooth. Unlike Augustus, who had spent years consolidating power and winning public favor, Tiberius was stepping into authority with a reputation that was far less admired. His reluctance to take power, his withdrawn personality, and his strained relationship with the Senate all contributed to an uncertain beginning. The first major challenge Tiberius faced was proving his legitimacy. Although Augustus had adopted him and made him his heir, there was no clear legal framework for imperial succession. The Senate had to officially confirm his position, but Tiberius approached this with hesitation. He feigned reluctance, refusing to immediately accept full power, instead allowing the Senate to deliberate on the matter. This was a calculated move. Augustus had built an empire that functioned on the illusion of republican rule, and Tiberius sought to maintain this illusion. However, his unwillingness to assert himself decisively created uncertainty. Unlike Augustus, who had masterfully blended authoritarian control with senatorial cooperation, Tiberius appeared hesitant and uncharismatic, which made the transition more difficult than it needed to be. The Senate, for its part, was uncertain about Tiberius's rule. Many senators had enjoyed a close relationship with Augustus and now found themselves dealing with a ruler who was far less engaging. Tiberius did not cultivate the same public image as his predecessor, nor did he go out of his way to charm the Senate. He was known for his serious, often cryptic style of communication, and his distrust of flattery made him wary of sycophantic advisors. This led to a strained relationship between the emperor and the Senate, as he neither courted their approval nor sought to dominate them outright. Instead, he left much of the Senate's traditional authority intact but was often indifferent to their concerns. This approach created tension. Senators who had been accustomed to Augustus's careful balancing of power now found themselves dealing with a ruler who did not play the same political games. One of the most significant figures in Tiberius's early reign was his mother, Livia Drusilla. As the widow of Augustus and one of the most powerful women in Roman history, Livia held considerable influence over both court politics and Tiberius himself. She had been instrumental in securing his succession, and her presence in the imperial court continued to shape events. Many Romans believed that she wielded undue influence over her son, with some even suggesting that she had hastened Augustus's death to secure Tiberius's position. While there is no definitive evidence of this, Livia's political acumen was undeniable. She had spent years maneuvering within Augustus's court, ensuring that her son remained a viable heir despite Augustus's earlier preference for his grandsons. Her continued presence at court created friction. While Tiberius owed much of his position to his mother, he resented her influence. He had spent much of his life under the shadow of stronger figures, first Augustus and now Livia, and he struggled to assert himself independently. Livia's continued political activity, including her correspondence with senators and governors, undermined Tiberius's authority in subtle but significant ways. Some senators saw her as the true power behind the throne, further complicating Tiberius's relationship with Rome's political elite. This tension would continue until Livia's death in 29 CE, after which Tiberius distanced himself even further from Rome, retreating into isolation. Beyond political maneuvering in Rome, Tiberius had to deal with serious military challenges. Augustus had left behind a vast and complex empire, and the stability of its frontiers was one of the new emperor's primary concerns. Almost immediately after Augustus's death, a crisis erupted within the legions. Mutinies broke out among the troops stationed in Pannonia and the Rhine, fueled by grievances over harsh conditions, long service terms, and inadequate pay. These legions had sworn loyalty to Augustus, and his death created uncertainty about their obligations to Tiberius. The situation was particularly dangerous because Rome's military strength depended on the loyalty of its legions. If the mutinies spread, they could threaten the stability of the empire itself. Tiberius, however, was hesitant to confront the issue personally. Instead, he sent his son Drusus to deal with the unrest in Pannonia, while Germanicus, his adopted son and a popular general, was dispatched to handle the mutiny in the Rhine. Both men successfully restored order, but their methods differed. Drusus relied on a mixture of negotiation and force, eventually subduing the rebellious soldiers. Germanicus, however, took a more dramatic approach. He personally engaged with the troops, addressing their grievances and offering concessions before leading them on a campaign against Germanic tribes to redirect their aggression. These mutinies highlighted an ongoing issue in Tiberius's reign, his reluctance to engage in the kind of grand public performances that had defined Augustus's leadership. Whereas Augustus had always sought to maintain a connection with the people and the military, Tiberius preferred to rule from a distance. His failure to personally address the military unrest reinforced the perception that he was a cold and detached ruler, a perception that would only grow stronger as his reign progressed. Tiberius's military policies reflected his cautious nature. Unlike Augustus, who had pursued expansionist campaigns in an effort to secure Rome's frontiers, Tiberius was more interested in consolidation. He believed that further expansion would place unnecessary strain on Rome's resources and that securing existing territories was more important than acquiring new ones. This marked a shift in Rome's military strategy. Rather than aggressively pushing into new lands, Tiberius focused on fortifying the empire's borders and maintaining stability within the provinces. This approach was most evident in his handling of the Germanic frontier. The catastrophic defeat of Varus's legions in the Teutoburg forest in 9 CE had shattered Rome's ambitions in Germany, and Tiberius was unwilling to risk further losses. While Germanicus conducted several campaigns in the region to avenge Rome's defeat, Tiberius ultimately recalled him, signaling a retreat from Augustus's expansionist policies. This decision was pragmatic, but it was also unpopular among those who saw it as a sign of weakness. Many Romans still harbored dreams of conquering Germania, and Tiberius's unwillingness to pursue these ambitions contributed to his unpopularity. Amid these military and political challenges, one figure began to rise in prominence: Lucius Aelius Sejanus, the Praetorian prefect. Sejanus commanded the Praetorian Guard, the elite force responsible for protecting the emperor. Under Augustus, the Praetorians had been a relatively low-profile force, but under Tiberius their influence grew. Sejanus, an ambitious and cunning official, recognized that Tiberius's aloofness created an opportunity. He positioned himself as the emperor's closest advisor, gradually consolidating power behind the scenes. Sejanus's rise was gradual but methodical. He secured Tiberius's trust by presenting himself as a loyal and efficient administrator. He also worked to increase the power of the Praetorian Guard, centralizing their barracks in Rome to make them a more visible and influential force. This move made the Guard more than just a protective detail, it transformed them into a key player in Roman politics. With the Guard's loyalty secured, Sejanus became an indispensable figure in Tiberius's administration. Tiberius, who had little interest in day-to-day governance, increasingly relied on Sejanus to manage affairs in Rome. This dynamic played into Tiberius's own tendencies. He preferred to delegate authority rather than engage in political maneuvering himself. Sejanus took full advantage of this, positioning himself as the true power in Rome while Tiberius withdrew further from public life. By the early 20 CE, Sejanus was one of the most powerful men in Rome. He controlled access to the emperor, influenced appointments to key positions, and had the backing of the Praetorian Guard. His growing influence was met with suspicion by some members of the Senate, but with Tiberius's support, there was little they could do to challenge him. His ambitions, however, were far from satisfied. He sought to eliminate potential rivals and further cement his authority, setting the stage for the political purges that would define the later years of Tiberius's reign. The early years of Tiberius's rule were marked by caution, political maneuvering, and military restraint. He faced the enormous challenge of following Augustus, a ruler who had spent decades shaping the empire. His reluctance to fully embrace the role of emperor created uncertainty, while his reserved nature alienated both the Senate and the people of Rome. At the same time, his military policies reflected a pragmatic approach, favoring stability over expansion. However, his increasing reliance on Sejanus introduced a new element into Roman politics, one that would have profound consequences in the years to come. As Sejanus's influence grew, Tiberius's reign would take a darker turn, leading to an era of paranoia, political purges, and ultimate isolation. The year 23 CE marked a turning point in the reign of Tiberius. Up until this point, his rule had been characterized by cautious governance, military consolidation, and an uneasy relationship with the Senate. However, everything changed with the sudden death of his only biological son, Drusus. The loss deeply affected him, not only on a personal level but also politically. Drusus had been the only clear successor to the throne, and his death created a vacuum that would ultimately be exploited by the ambitious and ruthless Lucius Aelius Sejanus. Sejanus had already been rising in influence for years, serving as the commander of the Praetorian Guard. The Praetorian Guard was initially formed to protect the emperor, but under Sejanus, it became a powerful political tool. He centralized their quarters in Rome, giving them more direct access to the heart of imperial power. With Drusus's death, Sejanus saw an opportunity to solidify his control over the government. Tiberius, mourning the loss of his son, began withdrawing further from Rome, leaving much of the day-to-day governance in Sejanus's hands. One of the most infamous aspects of Sejanus's rise to power was his strategic use of treason trials, known as the Maestas trials. These trials had been originally established to prosecute crimes against the state, but Sejanus manipulated them to eliminate political enemies. The mere accusation of disloyalty to the emperor was enough to bring someone to trial, and conviction often led to exile or execution. This created a climate of fear in Rome, as senators, equestrians, and even members of the imperial family were accused, tried, and condemned based on little more than suspicion or personal vendettas. During this time, Sejanus also worked to consolidate his position by ingratiating himself with Tiberius's family. He sought to marry into the imperial line and pursued an alliance with Drusus's widow, Livilla. It is widely believed that Sejanus and Livilla conspired to poison Drusus, removing the strongest rival to Sejanus's ambitions. With Drusus out of the way, Sejanus's power grew unchecked, and he set his sights even higher. By 26 CE, Tiberius had become increasingly disillusioned with Rome and its politics. Tired of dealing with the Senate, worn down by the pressures of rule, and perhaps influenced by the manipulations of Sejanus, he decided to leave Rome entirely. He retreated to the island of Capri, a secluded and luxurious retreat far from the intrigues of the capital. From this remote position, Tiberius still technically ruled the empire, but in reality Sejanus was now the de facto ruler of Rome. With Tiberius on Capri, Sejanus's influence reached its peak. He controlled access to the emperor, filtering information that reached him and controlling the messages sent in return. Many senators and officials had no choice but to align themselves with Sejanus or risk being accused of treason. His power was so absolute that many began to assume he was the next in line for the throne. Some even speculated that Tiberius might formally adopt him, making him the official heir. Sejanus's unchecked authority, however, also led to arrogance. He made the critical mistake of overestimating his invincibility. By 31 CE, suspicions had begun to arise. Tiberius, despite his physical absence from Rome, was not completely blind to what was happening. Whispers of Sejanus's ambition, combined with reports of his increasingly oppressive rule, began to reach the emperor. The loyalty of the Praetorian Guard was also not as absolute as Sejanus believed. While he had secured their support, many officers remained ultimately loyal to the imperial family. Tiberius decided to act. Working behind the scenes, he orchestrated a sudden and dramatic reversal of Sejanus's fortunes. In a carefully planned move, Tiberius sent a letter to the Senate, initially praising Sejanus but then subtly hinting at his growing concerns about the prefect's loyalty. The shift in tone alarmed the senators, and before Sejanus could react, the letter was followed by direct orders for his arrest. The moment Sejanus was removed from power, the fragile edifice of his influence collapsed. The same people who had once feared him now turned against him with a vengeance. The Senate, eager to prove their loyalty to Tiberius, swiftly condemned Sejanus to death. He was executed, and his body was thrown down the Gemonian stairs, a fate reserved for the most despised criminals of Rome. The downfall of Sejanus, however, did not bring immediate stability. Instead, it marked the beginning of an even darker period in Rome. Tiberius, now fully aware of how deeply Sejanus had corrupted his government, responded with a reign of terror. The paranoia that had simmered for years now boiled over, leading to a brutal purge of anyone associated with Sejanus. His allies, his family, and even those who had simply remained neutral were caught up in a wave of executions and exiles. This period saw an increase in the use of informers and secret trials. Accusations of treason became rampant, and no one was safe from suspicion. The Senate, eager to cleanse itself of any perceived disloyalty, actively participated in the bloodshed. Many prominent Romans who had once aligned with Sejanus were executed, and their properties were confiscated. Tiberius's withdrawal to Capri became even more extreme. Now fully distrustful of nearly everyone in Rome, he surrounded himself with astrologers, informers, and a small circle of trusted servants. His isolation contributed to an image of a ruler who had abandoned his empire, allowing chaos to fester in the capital. While the administration of the empire continued, it did so under an atmosphere of fear and repression. This period of paranoia and political purges solidified Tiberius's reputation as a tyrant. Although he had not initially sought to rule through terror, the events that unfolded after Sejanus's fall left him with few trusted allies and an overwhelming sense of betrayal. The Rome he had once reluctantly governed had become a place of treachery and bloodshed, a stark contrast to the order and stability of Augustus's reign. As the years passed, Tiberius's detachment from Rome only deepened, setting the stage for the final years of his rule, which would be marked by even greater isolation and a growing sense that the empire was slipping into decline. Tiberius's reign was marked by a distinctive approach to governance that reflected his cautious, pragmatic and at times aloof nature. Unlike his predecessor Augustus, who had carefully cultivated the image of a benevolent ruler while maintaining absolute power, Tiberius was far less concerned with public perception. His administrative policies were efficient, and in many respects he strengthened the empire's bureaucratic foundations. However, his reluctance to engage directly with Rome's political elite and his increasing reliance on fear and treason trials led to a reign that was both stable and oppressive. One of the defining aspects of his governance was his insistence on maintaining the structures put in place by Augustus while reducing extravagance. He sought to curb excessive spending, promote financial stability, and ensure that the empire did not overextend itself militarily or economically. He was deeply conservative in his economic policies, favoring frugality and fiscal responsibility over grand projects or unnecessary wars of expansion. This restraint helped maintain the empire's financial health, though it also contributed to the perception that he was an indifferent and uninspiring ruler. His taxation policies reflected this same philosophy. He did not introduce radical reforms but instead ensured that existing systems functioned efficiently. The tax collection mechanisms that had been refined under Augustus remained in place, and he made efforts to prevent corruption among tax collectors. One of his key achievements was cracking down on provincial governors who exploited their positions for personal gain. He believed that the provinces should be governed fairly and that excessive taxation would lead to unrest. By maintaining strict oversight, he ensured that provincial revenues remained stable without overburdening the population. Tiberius's approach to economic policy was also reflected in his reluctance to embark on ambitious building projects in Rome. Unlike Augustus, who had famously boasted that he had found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble, Tiberius did not invest heavily in grand architectural undertakings. This lack of visible achievements in Rome contributed to the perception that he was disengaged, though it was in line with his broader policy of financial conservatism. His administration of law and justice was one of the most controversial aspects of his rule, particularly due to the increasing use of the maestas trials. These trials, which dealt with crimes of treason, were originally intended to protect the stability of the state. However, under Tiberius they became a tool for political repression. What had initially been a means of punishing genuine threats to the empire gradually evolved into a mechanism for eliminating perceived enemies and rivals. Accusations of treason became more common as informers, delators, gained influence. These informers, often motivated by personal gain or political ambition, played a key role in bringing charges against senators, equestrians, and other members of Rome's elite. The consequences of a conviction were severe, often resulting in exile or execution, with the accused property confiscated by the state. The atmosphere of fear that these trials created damaged Tiberius's relationship with the Senate, which increasingly viewed him as a ruler who governed through intimidation rather than cooperation. Despite this, Tiberius maintained a complex and often contradictory relationship with the Senate. On one hand, he sought to uphold its authority, refusing to take on the trappings of an absolute ruler. He avoided excessive displays of power and insisted that the Senate play a key role in governance. He frequently deferred to senatorial decisions and was careful not to undermine its institutional authority, at least in theory. On the other hand, his policies and actions, particularly his use of treason trials, created an environment where senators lived in fear of falling out of favor. His reluctance to engage directly with them only worsened the situation, as it made him appear distant and unapproachable. His governance extended beyond Rome, and his relationship with the provinces was critical to maintaining the stability of the empire. Unlike some of his predecessors and successors, he did not seek to expand the empire's borders aggressively. Instead, he focused on consolidating existing territories and ensuring that they were administered efficiently. He appointed competent governors and expected them to rule fairly, punishing those who exploited their positions for personal enrichment. His policies in the provinces reflected his broader philosophy of maintaining order through careful administration rather than military conquest. One of the most significant aspects of his provincial administration was his handling of military affairs. Tiberius had been a successful general before becoming emperor, and he understood the importance of maintaining a disciplined and well-managed army. He ensured that soldiers were paid regularly and that military campaigns were conducted with clear strategic goals. His decision to withdraw from unnecessary conflicts and avoid costly wars of expansion was in contrast to the more aggressive policies of some later emperors. This approach contributed to the long-term stability of the empire, even if it made him appear passive to those who favored a more expansionist policy. Tiberius's rule was marked by a paradox. He was an emperor who valued order and efficiency, yet his reign became associated with fear and repression. His governance was pragmatic and in many ways, beneficial to the empire's stability, but his personal detachment and reliance on treason trials alienated much of the Roman elite. His economic and administrative policies ensured that the empire remained financially and politically stable, but his reluctance to engage with Rome's political class contributed to his reputation as a cold and indifferent ruler. As the years passed, his isolation deepened, and his governance became increasingly characterized by paranoia. His initial attempts to rule in a balanced and measured manner were gradually overshadowed by his growing suspicion of those around him. The combination of his administrative competence and his oppressive methods made his reign one of contradictions, a period of stability and fear, of efficiency and repression. His legacy remains one of the most complex of any Roman emperor, as historians continue to debate whether his cautious, pragmatic rule ultimately strengthened the empire or sowed the seeds of future instability. Tiberius's later years were marked by increasing withdrawal from Rome and a growing sense of paranoia. By 31 CE, he had effectively removed himself from the daily governance of the empire, retreating to the island of Capri. This self-imposed isolation was partly due to his disillusionment with Rome's political elite and the growing number of betrayals he perceived around him. The downfall and execution of Sejanus in 31 CE had reinforced his mistrust, and rather than returning to Rome to reassert his authority, he chose to govern remotely, relying on intermediaries such as the Praetorian prefect Macro and his eventual successor, Caligula. On Capri, Tiberius led a life shrouded in rumors and speculation. Ancient historians, particularly Suetonius and Tacitus, painted a grim picture of his time there, accusing him of indulging in debauchery and perverse pleasures. However, these accounts are often considered exaggerated and heavily biased. While Tiberius was known for his stern and austere personality, there is little concrete evidence to support the most lurid claims about his behavior. What is more certain is that he continued to wield power from a distance, issuing orders and directives while leaving much of the daily governance to his officials in Rome. During this period, two figures rose to prominence: Gaius Julius Caesar, better known as Caligula, and the new Praetorian prefect, Naevius Sutorius Macro. Caligula, the son of Germanicus, had long been a popular figure in Rome, and Tiberius had taken him under his protection after the deaths of Germanicus and his older brothers. While Tiberius had no great affection for Caligula, he recognized his importance as a potential successor, particularly as he lacked other viable heirs. Macro, meanwhile, replaced Sejanus as the head of the Praetorian Guard and played a crucial role in maintaining order in Rome during Tiberius's absence. Tiberius's health began to decline in his final years, though the exact nature of his ailments remains uncertain. Some sources suggest he suffered from chronic pain and possibly heart disease, while others describe symptoms that could be interpreted as signs of depression or mental deterioration. His last political actions were marked by indecision over the succession. While he had named both Caligula and his grandson Tiberius Gemellus as co-heirs, it was clear that Caligula had the stronger support base, particularly with Macro's backing. The circumstances of Tiberius's death in 37 CE remain a subject of controversy. According to some accounts, he died of natural causes at the age of 77. However, other sources suggest that he was murdered, either by Macro or on the orders of Caligula. One widely repeated story claims that Tiberius initially appeared to recover after being declared dead, prompting Macro to smother him with a pillow to ensure his demise. Whether this account is true or merely another sensationalized rumor, it is clear that his death was met with little mourning in Rome. The Senate, which had long chafed under his rule, quickly moved to confirm Caligula as his successor, and there were widespread celebrations among the Roman populace. Tiberius's legacy remains one of the most complex and debated among Roman emperors. Contemporary views on his reign were largely negative, shaped by the writings of historians such as Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio. These authors portrayed him as a cruel, suspicious, and reclusive ruler who governed through fear and repression. Tacitus, in particular, depicted him as a ruler who had started with promise but had ultimately succumbed to paranoia and tyranny. Suetonius took an even more scandalous approach, focusing on rumors of his alleged depravity on Capri. Cassius Dio, writing later, presented a somewhat more balanced perspective, acknowledging his administrative competence while still criticizing his methods. Despite these negative portrayals, Tiberius's impact on the Roman Empire was significant. He maintained the stability of Augustus's system, ensuring that the empire remained secure and financially solvent. His military policies, while cautious, helped prevent unnecessary conflicts and kept the borders stable. His economic prudence left Rome with a strong treasury, which later emperors would rely upon. However, his reliance on treason trials and his distant, often indifferent approach to ruling created an atmosphere of fear and resentment, particularly among the Senate and the aristocracy. The transition to Caligula marked a dramatic shift in the Julio-Claudian dynasty. While Tiberius had been a cautious and reserved ruler, Caligula quickly became known for his extravagance, erratic behavior, and eventual descent into tyranny. The contrast between their styles of rule further cemented Tiberius's reputation as a dark and joyless emperor. However, in hindsight, his reign provided a crucial bridge between the more overtly monarchical rule of Augustus and the later excesses of the Julio-Claudian emperors. Modern reappraisals of Tiberius have been more nuanced than those of ancient historians. While his methods were often harsh, his administrative competence and military strategy are now recognized as key factors in the empire's long-term stability. Some scholars argue that his reluctance to engage in unnecessary wars and his financial conservatism were actually signs of wisdom rather than weakness. Others point out that his use of treason trials, while brutal, was not entirely unprecedented in Roman history and was partly a product of the political culture of the time. Ultimately, Tiberius remains a figure of contradictions. He was a capable ruler who maintained the empire's strength, yet he was also a man whose paranoia and reclusiveness alienated those around him. He avoided the cult of personality that Augustus had carefully crafted, but in doing so, he left behind a legacy that was easier to vilify than to admire. His reign was neither a disaster nor a golden age. It was a period of stability overshadowed by fear, a time of competent governance marred by a lack of trust and connection with the Roman people. Tiberius's reign as the second emperor of Rome remains one of the most complex and controversial periods in Roman history. Succeeding Augustus, a ruler who had effectively shaped the empire into a stable, centralized system, Tiberius faced the monumental task of maintaining that legacy while navigating his own challenges. His rule, spanning from 14 CE to 37 CE, was marked by a mix of stability, administrative efficiency, military caution, and increasing political paranoia. Unlike Augustus, who cultivated public adoration and a sense of near-divine leadership, Tiberius was a reserved, often reluctant ruler who distanced himself from the public eye, earning him both respect and resentment. One of the defining features of Tiberius's reign was his relationship with the Senate and the broader Roman elite. Initially, he maintained a cautious approach, seeking to uphold the institutions Augustus had established. He avoided unnecessary expansion, conserved financial resources, and preferred a more bureaucratic style of governance. However, as time passed, his suspicion of the Senate grew, leading to a climate of fear and repression. The treason trials, maestas trials, which became more frequent during his rule, created an atmosphere of paranoia in Rome, where accusations of disloyalty could result in exile or execution. While some of these trials may have been necessary for maintaining control, their increasing use alienated many among the ruling class and tarnished his reputation. Tiberius's foreign and military policies also set him apart from his predecessor. Unlike Augustus, who had expanded Rome's frontiers, Tiberius took a more defensive stance, prioritizing consolidation over conquest. He believed in securing existing borders rather than overextending Rome's military resources, a strategy that likely contributed to the long-term stability of the empire. His handling of military affairs was efficient. He quelled mutinies early in his reign and ensured that Rome's legions remained disciplined. However, his decision to withdraw from direct military leadership later in his reign further distanced him from the army, which had traditionally been a key source of an emperor's support. Perhaps the most infamous aspect of Tiberius's rule was his withdrawal from Rome in 26 CE to live on the island of Capri. This decision, while not entirely unprecedented, left Rome under the influence of his trusted officials, most notably Sejanus, the ambitious Praetorian prefect. Sejanus's rise to power, his manipulation of the political system, and his eventual downfall in 31 CE created a period of instability that highlighted the weaknesses in Tiberius's hands-off approach to governance. Though Sejanus was ultimately removed and executed, the damage had been done. Rome had experienced years of intrigue, purges, and internal strife in the absence of an actively engaged emperor. Despite his political and personal failings, Tiberius's reign was not without merit. He maintained fiscal discipline, leaving Rome with a surplus in its treasury. His cautious military policies ensured that Rome's resources were not wasted on reckless expansion, and he continued to develop the administrative systems put in place by Augustus. His governance of the provinces, while not revolutionary, was effective, and he ensured that Rome remained secure and functional. When evaluating the lessons from his leadership, one key takeaway is the importance of maintaining a strong connection with the people and political institutions of an empire. Tiberius's increasing isolation, both physical and emotional, weakened his ability to govern effectively. His reliance on intermediaries such as Sejanus and later Macro allowed unchecked power to fall into the hands of opportunists, leading to widespread fear and instability. His reign demonstrates that even a competent and pragmatic ruler can struggle if they fail to maintain a direct and visible presence in government. Another lesson is the balance between security and oppression. While maintaining control is essential for any ruler, excessive paranoia and the overuse of treason trials created an atmosphere of fear that ultimately harmed Tiberius's reputation. A more measured approach to dissent and opposition might have prevented the deep resentment that built up during his later years. Tiberius's place in Roman history is one of contradiction. He was neither a great emperor nor a disastrous one. Rather, he was a capable but deeply flawed leader whose strengths in administration and military strategy were overshadowed by his reclusive nature and his failure to inspire loyalty and admiration. His rule set the stage for the dramatic reign of his successor, Caligula, and contributed to the broader trajectory of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. In the grand scheme of the Roman Empire, Tiberius represents a cautionary tale about leadership. His reign highlights the challenges of succession, the dangers of excessive suspicion, and the risks of ruling from a distance. Yet, his contributions to Rome's financial and military stability cannot be ignored. He ensured that Augustus's system remained intact, allowing the empire to continue thriving long after his death. In the end, Tiberius remains an enigmatic figure, an emperor who ruled effectively but without affection, a leader who maintained Rome's strength but at the cost of his own reputation. His reign serves as both an example of administrative competence and a warning about the perils of isolation and distrust in leadership.